Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our epilogue episode on the most important battles of the Civil War. We have encountered so many interesting characters throughout this process that it wouldn't be right if we didn't see what happened to them. I think of it at the closing credits of Animal House, where it says what happened to these people. One of them becomes a senator. Another one just disappears without a trace. The figures that have come into the Civil War are interesting because some of them are politicians. Almost everyone was in the military, went to West Point, fought in the Mexican-American War. Almost none were career military men because simply the U.S. had such a small military before the Civil War. So you have some of these figures who start up businesses, they fail, or they're philosophy professors, they're bishops, they come from all walks of life, they're slave plantation owners, and they join the war effort. Some do poorly, some do fantastically. But once the war is over, once America demobilizes, where do they go? Do they go back to their lives? Do they start up new ventures? Are they post-war celebrities? Well, that's what James and I are going to do in this episode. And because on this podcast, we haven't delved into this identity too much, but we have a Yankee and a Confederate or a Yankee and a rebel. What do you prefer? What's your chosen title?
I'll go with rebel. I don't know.
Rebel, yeah. Hard to say. So, we figured it'd be fair if we ping-pong back and forth. So I'll talk about what happens to the Union soldiers, and James will talk about the Confederate soldiers. And not just soldiers, but also people as part of the Union side.
Before we go on, let me clarify. I'm not a unreconstructed Southerner.
I mean, you're probably Texan first, right?
No, I'm a Union man. I'm a Southern Unionist.
There you are. So there were a lot of Whigs and people like that who didn't support secession. And yeah, let's just not dig ourselves any further. So we'll just take James where he is and we'll just talk about these people and go back and forth. So, and we're also going to start at the top of the pyramid and move our way down. So I'm going to start with Lincoln, and then James will dig into his counterpart. And we'll try to do that as well as possible. He'll describe Davis, and then we'll go with those counterparts back and forth. All right, Lincoln. Well, I mean, what is there to say? I mean, sadly, he's assassinated very shortly after the Civil War ends on April 14th, 1865, only 4 days after Lee's surrender. So he probably suffers worse than any other president. You can look at pictures of what he looks like from 1860 to 1865, and every president ages on the job due to the stress of the job, but Lincoln really takes it hard. And as we talked about the first few years of the war effort, Lincoln's quote is saying, "If there is a hell, I am in it." He's only 56 years old. After a long funeral procession, he's buried near his home in Springfield, Illinois, and widely considered to be one of our finest presidents, both for remaining steadfast through the war, for emancipating the slaves, but his vision of trying to reconcile America afterwards. And I just want to touch on a little bit here because it's worth focusing on. So what Lincoln wanted to do was avoid a low boiling hatred between the two sides that would result in another war a few decades later, kind of like what happened in Europe after World War I. It was a poorly constructed peace that just led to World War II. So he said, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, God gives us to see the light. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who small have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan." And it goes on. But all that to say, that was not a popular opinion. There were figures. One is Henry Ward Beecher, who was a very popular national preacher who wanted the South to pay. He said, "I charge the whole guilt of this war upon the ambitious, educated, plotting political leaders of the South. A day will come when God will reveal judgment and arraign at his bar these mighty miscreants." So Lincoln could have called fire and brimstone like that and just paved the way for another war to come, but he did his best to try to heal the wounds of America. And once Lincoln dies, very quickly he takes on a mythical character. And Ralph Waldo Emerson said in his eulogy of Lincoln that, "I am sure if this man had ruled in a period of less facility of printing, he would have become mythological in a very few years, like Aesop. So very quickly recognized as one of America's greatest presidents and mythologized. So that's Lincoln.
All right, my turn. Jefferson Davis, Lincoln's counterpart in the South. We saw in one of the last episodes how Davis tried to get away. He tried to escape. He was heading for, I believe it was Georgia, he was wanting to try to get to, maybe try to fight another day. But he was captured on May 10th, 1865. And after that, he served 2 years in prison at Fort Monroe, Virginia. But after his release, he lived the rest of his life off the charity of a wealthy widow. Always good work if you can get it, right? Pretty good gig there. I'd like to do that myself someday. Anyway, he worked on a massive memoir. He spent most of his retirement writing this book, The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government. And this is one of the many works in which former Confederates tried to justify their actions and tried to downpedal the slavery thing. And we'll talk more about this in the lost cause discussion we're going to have. But he was trying to downpedal the importance of slavery and make it more about states' rights and all that. And anyway, go into that later perhaps. But so Davis lives a pretty good long life. He dies in 1889 at the age of 81, and he would be a hero to the South for many decades after that. Really until just recently. It's kind of interesting. I'll mention in passing, Scott, I don't have this in the notes, but Houston Independent School District had a high school named Jefferson Davis High School. And that name was just changed about 2 or 3 years ago to something else. I can't remember what it was, but he's one of these Confederates who's statues are being taken down. And I'm not going to weigh in one way or the other on that. That's not my point, but it's interesting to see how his legacy has changed in the South over time. And I think we're going to see probably it's going to even decrease even more in the future. I know when I was at UT, there was a statue of Jefferson Davis on the main grounds, the 40 acres, they call it, the original campus. And that's been gone for quite some time now.
Yeah.
So much for Davis.
Right. I mean, so as you can see, the Civil War casts a very long shadow. This has relevancy in a ways that other battles don't. Yeah, so I guess kind of moving down the pyramid a little bit with Ulysses S. Grant. He was general-in-chief of the Army after the war. Some have said that it's a tragedy for Grant that if he would have been shot right after exiting Appomattox Courthouse, he would go down in history as one of the greatest Americans who ever lived. However, he did not. He lived on. So that colors his legacy a little bit because he wasn't a terribly popular president, and some of that retroactively colors how people viewed him as a general, despite him being quite competent. So he becomes the first person ever to become a 4-star general, like James talked about. He's nominated as a Republican candidate for president in 1868 and then elected. He serves 2 terms that are plagued by scandal, although Grant was mostly honest or completely honest. And after he leaves the White House, he moves to New York, where he lent his name to a Wall Street brokerage firm. But one of his partners stole millions from the firm, not as good of a broker as he is a general. So Grant is destitute. This is before the period of presidential pensions or the speaking circuit that ensure any ex-president today to be a millionaire once they leave office. At about the same time as this, Grant is diagnosed with throat cancer. So he works on his memoirs, trying to secure financial stability for his family. And he dies in 1885 at the age of 63. Well, his memoirs are a success. They sell 500,000 copies, and they restore his family's fortune.
You know, if I can chime in, it's interesting that you mentioned how his reputation overall was brought down by his presidency, which was definitely a failure by any stretch of the imagination. There were some good accomplishments, but it's interesting that as of late, there's been a rebirth of Grant's reputation, if you will. He's really risen up through the ranks. You look at the presidential rankings that the historians do every 5 to 10 years or whatever, and he's been going up. And we've had 3 major best-selling biographies come out of Grant recently. The one, I think it's just called Grant by Gene Edward Smith. Then you had one come out couple years ago called American Ulysses by Ronald White. I read that. It was excellent. And then last year, 2017, we're recording this in 2018, but in 2017, we had Ron Chernow, the biography extraordinaire of Washington and Hamilton. And he came out with his own Grant biography, which has been very popular. In fact, I think I'm going to go to a signing of that pretty soon. I got to remember the date. My son-in-law once mentioned it to me, but I foolishly did not write down the date, so I got to go check that out. That would be neat to go to. But anyway, and there are plans to make that into a movie. So maybe by the time some people are listening to this, it will have already come out. It's projected that Leonardo DiCaprio is going to play Grant, so that should be very interesting. So yeah, Grant's making a comeback after all these years. It'll be interesting to see what happens in the next decade or two.
And I think part of that, the whole myth of the lost cause, the early drafts of the Civil War history were written mostly by Southerners who talk about Grant as a butcher and a drunk, like we've mentioned in this series, and that there's still clouds hanging over his legacy. But how about Lee? What's he up to after the war?
Well, soon after the war, Lee swore allegiance to the Union, and he inspired thousands of other former Confederates to follow suit. There was an insurance company that came to Lee and offered him $50,000 for the use of his name. Lee, yeah, it's a Robert E. Lee Insurance Company. Yeah, best, the general likes this insurance, but Lee actually turned them down. Can you believe that? $50,000, which that in today's money, that's probably like $750,000 maybe. Lee said, "I cannot accept payment for services that I do not render." You just don't see that kind of character very much anymore. Lee instead takes a position as the president of Washington College, which is in Western Virginia, and he serves there until his death at age 63 in 1870. So he didn't outlast the war too long. 5 years after the war ends, he dies. He had suffered from heart problems for quite some time. The college, incidentally, was later renamed Washington and Lee College, and now it's Washington and Lee University. And Lee's final words were, "Strike the tent." It's very appropriate. I got to say this, too, that it's interesting. I talked about Davis. There was also a Robert E. Lee High School in Houston ISD, and it's also had the name changed, I believe. I'm pretty sure. And he also had a statue at University of Texas, but that's also been taken down. So Lee, despite being a really good human being, a really good man, he's just was on the wrong side. And he was offered command of all the Union armies at the beginning of the war. And one of the great what ifs or counterfactuals, as we call them in the history discipline, is what if Lee had accepted? What if he had been the general in chief of the Union armies from the very beginning? Maybe the war would have lasted 6 months. I don't know. But
yeah, Lee with numerical superiority is a very interesting thing to contemplate.
Right. So that's Lee. And of course, Lee goes down, and again, we'll address this a little bit later, but Lee, after his death, becomes just about a god in the South. I mean, he's deified, and he's made into a saintly figure who could do no wrong. And that's obviously his reputation has fallen lately in recent decades, of course, because as more and more people have become so critical of the Confederacy. But he's an interesting character. He really is.
Yeah. So moving down the ranks for William Sherman, he remains in the Army, and he becomes the top general after Grant's inauguration in 1868. Military conflict in America, there's no major engagement in the following decades. A lot of what the military is up to is staffing forts, especially on the western frontier. So he serves during much of the nation's war against the Plains Indians, which is fighting against a foe that is very undermanned. Tactics can't possibly match the U.S. military. He retires from the Army in 1883. When his name was mentioned as a possible presidential candidate, he famously said, "If nominated, I will not run. If elected, I will not serve." And I should mention that when James and I did Presidential Fight Club, it seemed that about a quarter of all U.S. presidents were connected to the Civil War somehow. So up until presidents in the, I don't know, 1920s, 1930s, maybe not that